So hey everybody, one more time. I decided about halfway through that first video that I needed to split this into two separate videos instead of making this one so long. So part two of 7.5b. This is the conclusion of everything World War I. A little bit less on the military side, more on the diplomacy side on this one as we're taking a look at the debates and the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Here we go. So I think to really kind of keep this whole topic in mind and get a clear picture of it, it really has to be in the context of these imperialism, interventionist, isolationist kind of debates the United States has been having. When the U.S. entered World War I, it was a real break from that tradition of non-involvement with European affairs. And by the time you get to the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson is deeply involved with these negotiations. As early as January 1918. This is like a few months after the U.S. declares war, but well before the end of the war. Woodrow Wilson is talking about his 14 points. I like the political cartoon here because he's trying to guide Wilhelm, he's the stand-in for the German people, trying to show the principles of like a free and open government that's going to protect people's rights and allow for self-determination of government, and really trying to promote the idea to make the world safe for democracy, to create a peace without victory, that you're not trying to create winners and losers out of this war, that you want to have like a free and open, almost like a, dare I say, a progressive mindset when trying to negotiate a settlement for this awful war that's been going on in Europe for the last 4 years. And so Wilson is promoting this idea both in the United States and in the European press to like the European people, to the German leaders, to the Allied leaders, and anybody else that's willing to listen on this. So when Wilson gets to the Versailles Peace Conference, so timeline on this, the 14 points is published in January 1918. 10 months later is the armistice on November 11th, 1918. And at that point, Wilson has announced he is going to go to the Versailles Peace Conference. He's going to go travel there as president and help negotiate this. The challenge here for Wilson is that he is coming to the table with his 14 points, but he is only going to be one of the big four. You can kind of see Wilson is there on the right side in this photo, and the other three guys, that is standing next to him, that is Henry Lloyd George. He is the British Prime Minister, and the two fellows on the left, that's Vittoriano Orlando and Georges Clemenceau. That is the leaders of Italy and France. They were considered the big four. I know that Italy's not really a big power in World War I. France is only really a big power in the sense that they were on the front line of the war for almost the entirety of the war. When Wilson is talking to these men about peace without victory and let's have like a very idealistic resolution to this, their response is, that's easy for you to say, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson has not had to live with the country in war for 4 years. He has not had to deal with hundreds of thousands of lives lost as a result of this war for 4 years. And so when it comes down to the terms of the peace conference, Wilson's 14 points, he's forced to negotiate and make concessions and compromises. And so when you actually get the terms of the peace treaty itself, there's like some victories and some losses for Wilson in the mix of this. One of the victories has to do with what happens in Eastern Europe. The nations in that bluish green color, what is that, teal? These are the new and reconstituted nations after World War I. And for the most part, these are nations that did not exist before the war. Poland has not existed as a modern country. It's been part of Russia. Same for Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. The Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia are all kind of carved out of the old Austrian Empire. These are new democratic nations where democratic nations never existed before. And so this is a success for Woodrow Wilson's 14 points because he is promoting the idea of self-determination of government, and this is definitely pointed in that direction. They're not going to be successful democracies because of all the issues leading towards World War II. But here in 1919, this looks like a resounding success. But the big issue with the Versailles Conference, with the Treaty of Versailles, is to figure out what to do with Germany. And the course of the war is going to the course of the treaty is essentially going to force Germany to accept guilt for the war. Even the war was started between Serbians and Austrians. Germany is forced to accept blame for the cause and for the course of the entire war. And this is going to include forcing Germany to pay for war reparations, war damages, $32 billion. That's going to essentially bankrupt the German economy and kind of lead to the creation of the Nazi Party and the Third Reich that's going to take us into another world war in 20 years later. The Germans will ultimately pay off all of the war reparations they're going to owe. The last payment was made, I believe it was 2010. A long pause in those payments through World War II. But when you're talking about things through the Cold War, it was considered an act of good faith to go ahead and pay out the reparations here in full to show European cooperation. There's not much European cooperation going on here. And then the other part of Wilson's treaty is designed to show European cooperation and kind of global cooperation. And the idea of the League of Nations is worked into the Treaty of Versailles. There will be a League of Nations, and it will be led by the British and the French, and as like major World War I allies. The Germans will not be allowed to join for a few years. The Soviet Union will not be allowed to join at all because of their communist status. Uh, but this is designed to be a global organization to prevent any war like World War I from ever happening again. And I know the irony in that. And one of the reasons that is so ironic, so much irony laced into the League of Nations, is the fact that the United States will not ever join the League of Nations. So when Wilson is in France and he is helping to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles, get the League of Nations Charter embedded into the Treaty of Versailles, he is convinced that this is the right thing to do for the improvement of the world, to protect democracy on a global scale. But when he gets home, he finds himself locked into a real serious struggle over the treaty and whether or not the treaty is going to be ratified. So just to make sure that where I'm clarifying on this, Wilson can negotiate the treaty and Wilson can kind of like do everything in like the negotiations and the creation of the treaty and the League of Nations. But in order for the United States government to officially sign on and agree to a treaty, it has to be ratified by the U.S. Senate. Okay, this is part of the checks and balances that comes into play here. So as part of those checks and balances, Wilson comes home and he needs to be able to convince the United States Senate that the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations is the right thing to do. Okay. Problem with this is by the time we get to the spring of 1919, the Republican Party has won the majority in the U.S. Senate, and Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat. Wilson, was asked to include Republican leadership in some of the treaty negotiation process in France, but Wilson declined. So Wilson, negotiated a treaty that kind of matched his progressive idealism, but that does not meet the current state of the Republican Party. The Republican Party in the 1910s is becoming an increasingly pro-business party, like conservative capitalist kind of agenda. And since Wilson is definitely a pro-interventionist foreign policy guy, the Republican Party is increasingly a non-intervention, kind of an isolationist group when it comes down to foreign policy issues. So Wilson faces opposition to the treaty on all kinds of different levels. There are some Americans that feel like the treaty doesn't go far enough. There are some Americans that feel like the war guilt clause against Germany is just completely unfair. These are people that have got like German heritage, or if they have got like other connections into Europe, it influences things. So when you're talking about this in terms of the League of Nations, you really kind of get to see two groups begin to kind of like solidify themselves, at least in the Senate, with these Senate Republicans. One group is called the irreconcilables. They have irreconcilable differences between what they believe and what the peace treaty is going to include. And so these are a small number of senators that say there is no change that could ever be made to this treaty that's going to make me want to vote for it. And so off the bat, Wilson knows that he is going to struggle to kind of get a certain number of votes. There's another set of Republican opponents to this, and they kind of get the nickname from this, the reservationists. They've got reservations about the treaty. The main reservation that the Senate Republicans have about the treaty has to do with the Mutual Defense Clause. It's Article 10 of the peace treaty, and it basically says that if one member of the League of Nations is attacked by an outside force, all members of the League of Nations have a responsibility to declare war and come to their defense immediately. So if World War I were to break out and the League of Nations was in effect, well, Serbia is a member of the League of Nations, so when Austria declares war against Serbia, the United States would have been obligated to declare war on Austria immediately. And according to these Senate Republicans, they feel like that is a violation of the Constitution because it kind of takes away the congressional power to declare war, because that is what is written in the Constitution. Only Congress can declare war. And so they start talking about ways to sort of back this off the treaty, or to find little loopholes to kind of let there be a vote to be involved with this. And this is where Wilson doesn't agree with it. And so he goes on the tour around the country to take his case to the American people. And then he has the stroke in Pueblo, Colorado. And ultimately, the peace treaty is going to be defeated. It comes up for a vote 3 different times in the U.S. Senate, and 3 different times the treaty is defeated. So the League of Nations, talk about something completely ironical on this, is going to be that Woodrow Wilson drafted the idea for the League of Nations, but he cannot convince his own country to be a part of it. And as a result of that, the League of Nations is going to be significantly weakened. It's going to have some success in the 1920s, and we'll see this later on in Unit 7b. But by the time you get to the 1930s, it doesn't have the ability to enforce its ideas and to enforce its goals and to enforce its rules and regulations about keeping peace. So it just kind of falls apart as World War II is getting started. For the United States and Germany, the United States is going to end up with a separate peace agreement with the German state that is going to be negotiated and signed in 1921. So the political cartoon here, like the bridge that would kind of bring everything all together, the keystone of the United States to kind of help that League of Nations bridge sort of solidify itself and remain stable, it just never falls into place. And since it doesn't fall into place, well, the League of Nations is not going to be stable, and it's going to fall apart as we get into World War II. World War II is going to come up for us in Unit 7b, but before we get there, we needed to look at the rest of the 1920s, so that is where we will pick up with things in class in the next day or two. Thanks for listening.